Thank you. Spiritus Blancus, Western Delicani, Avellaneda, and George Pagulatos from various parts of the world. This is it's a paper that comes from a project that we've been working on for a while. We are actually working on a book for OUP on the subject of the political economy of the European periphery, and I have this extravagant IRC logo here to comply with their requirements, because they very kindly gave the funding that's made this possible to let us start off this project. So why the European periphery? Before I start to tell you what we're doing here at all, it's a slightly improbable group of countries: Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain. Because from a political economy point of view, these are from different worlds or varieties of capitalism. We're perhaps used to thinking about Ireland as in an entirely different category from the other countries, because of the considerable economic success Ireland has had over the last 20 years or so. But the point really is of all this is, first of all, that these were the poorest countries in Europe for a long time. They were all hovering around very much at the end of the performance spectrum. Ireland pulled away in this more recent experience of growth. But they were the periphery for a long time, and they were the object of great concern to European policymakers about how to integrate these countries successfully in the expanding European Union, because of their lesser developed economies and because of their poorly diversified production structures. And they were brought back into focus again, of course, at the time of the crisis. Where we go? 2008, here we go, when everything went belly up. And once again, they came into a common frame as the so-called pigs, or gyps, or as we prefer to say. A category grouped together by their common experience, the common vulnerability to the worst effects of the crisis at this time. So this book is about tracking the long pathways from the periphery, essentially, and the evolution of the political economies of these countries under the pressure of the waves or the phases of European integration and the compliance requirements that these posed for political economies that are really quite diverse. And Greece, Portugal, and Spain are quite different from one another in interesting ways, as well as all being different from Ireland. So the motivation of this particular paper is that it's what I'm going to say now today. I'm trying not to talk for too long. It's more sort of theoretical, setting out some bit of a theoretical framework about how we might think about periphery or peripheries. And there's tables further down, which we can invert to if we need to later. But I just want to tell you that this particular paper it's for a special issue of a journal, and so it just pulls together some of the ways in which we might think about peripheries. And so the intention here in this particular paper is to say, well, if we really want to capture something about the financial vulnerabilities to which the European periphery has been prone, we don't have to look at this as a sui generis problem. This is not just a European problem. So what the crisis has done is that it's opened up a perspective on Europe that we haven't maybe thought of before. Financial crises have been endemic around the world for the last couple of hundred years, and within the last 100 years they've been mostly found in developing countries or emerging economies, as we more nicely say these days. So are there lessons to be drawn from emerging markets or emerging economy experiences? And I just from the outset, I think it's important to say we're not trying to overstate the case. We're not trying to stretch the concepts too far. When we're talking about periphery, the immediate assumption is, the immediate sort of expectation perhaps is to say, well, are you using Wallerstein, or what is this? And are you talking about a kind of Marxist core periphery analysis? dependencia all over again, all this old sort of 1970s discourse from South American countries about the terms in which they entered world markets. And the short answer is no. The short answer is that, no, we recognise that our 4 countries are the poorest amongst the rich countries, but very much among the rich countries in terms of their economic structure and organisation and the way in which they're embedded into international markets, before we even start talking about their political connections with or embeddedness in European institutions. So we're not trying to make a case for a new theory of periphery, nor are we trying to say that these countries are unequivocally periphery in anything like the same sense in which people have analysed global peripheries before. What we are saying is that there are perhaps some lessons to be drawn from countries that have found themselves in a structurally exposed situation in the world economy that can help us to understand some of the dynamics of what has been going on in European countries and why it is that the periphery countries found themselves kind of detached from a lot of the experiences of the richer or more deeply established, more deeply developed countries that we often call the core. So core periphery analysis is a common sort of terminology in the context of the crisis. But just exploring it, pushing down a little bit and saying, well, if we're really serious about this, how might we actually try to conceptualize it with reference to a wider range of countries in the more seriously, obviously less developed global periphery. And the motivation for this paper then follows on in saying that we can look at many aspects of the performance or the experiences of the European periphery. But what I'm talking about today is not so much about the trade or investment side of things. It's more about what lies behind those sorts of trends in the monetary side of core periphery relations, and the implications then for financial relationships or connectedness or embeddedness in financial networks. So monetary policy has been, of course, at the core of the European integration drive for the last 25 years, and before that, it goes right back to the 1970s. The challenges of managing floating economies were what gave rise to attempt to have semi-floating systems in the form of the European monetary system, and the instability that was experienced in trying to sustain EMS played a considerable part in persuading, the motivations, of course, for EMU were many and diverse, and economists will say deeply mistaken, just mainly political as a drive. But the political challenges of managing currency instability were what drove the move for the drive towards monetary unity. So this whole issue of monetary politics, exchange rate policy, and financial crises that ensue is very much the theme of this paper. And the paper was circulated, I think, right? Yesterday?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So this is really about, as I say, it's not trying to establish a new thesis. It's opening up a new perspective and out of the desire to promote a conversation about the implications of this broader way of thinking about European periphery relations. So it's again, it's there are many virtues in using the EU or even the Eurozone as a kind of natural laboratory of experimentation where almost everything else is held constant, and you look at variations then kind of country experiences and political economy experiences. But there's a lot to be gained also by widening the perspective and by asking, well, in relation to countries that have found themselves struggling to maintain their exchange rate relationships or their monetary stability in the world economy, whether there are some important commonalities that can shed light on our European experiences and insights into where we are now. So today I'm just going to say something about, firstly, the Eurozone periphery as an emerging market, or the emerging marketization, I shouldn't say, of the European periphery. And this is all developed a bit more fully in the paper, which I'm just about to send off. Now, when we're thinking about the periphery, when we're thinking about just analytically how we get a hold on it, these are the kinds of considerations that come into play. There's a politics behind monetary commitment that is, I think, very interesting to unpack. What is the motivation for making commitments, particularly to a fixed exchange rate regime or currency peg? Why would any country try to do that? What's the political motivation? What do they think are the gains to be had from that, both in the external stabilisation of the economy and in the internal, the creation of new internal coalitions? Why would they do that? Just to try to understand that. There's a politics behind it. And furthermore, the politics of monetary commitment push us further back to ask about other kinds of politics that may perhaps be less visible from using a purely economics-based perspective. Because the capacity to actually commit to a currency peg or to an exchange rate regime where you anchor your exchange rate to an external agent implies a state capacity of the state. I'm going to talk in a moment about what state capacity means, but the ability of the state to act strategically and effectively to sustain the commitments that it enters into. State capacity can't be taken for granted. And one of the problems with periphery countries is that state capacity is often not well developed, and this is one of the reasons why they end up in a periphery situation in the first place, or where they find themselves in a periphery situation. They don't have many of the capacities that make it possible for them to actually sustain the commitments that they enter into. And associated with that is that committing to making strong monetary commitments and pegging an exchange rate to an anchor that is not your domestic currency or your domestic control has to be actually managed within the politics of your own country as well. And so in countries that are democracies, or even countries that are not democracies, you can find a considerable delegitimation of the terms on which the mode of adjustment are to be managed and the distributive consequences of how that stabilisation is achieved. So the sustaining of a long-term monetary commitment implies both a lot of things about state capacity and also a lot of things about the terms of adjustment for the population that needs to be on board with this. And very often history shows us that it's actually the political, the management of domestic politics that causes these sorts of commitments to unravel. Not just in the periphery, but in the core as well. So the kinds of perspectives that we're drawing on come from, first of all, the experience of the gold standard from the late 19th century through to the 1930s, a period during which a great many countries sought to establish credibility and a leap forward into world markets for themselves through these engaging and through committing to gold standard and conditionality. And the gold standard, I suppose, has been much in our popular reflections and academic reflections at any rate since the crisis, because the problems of managing the gold standard were among those which gave rise to political, financial collapse, all the difficulties in managing depression during the 1930s, the political revolt against regimes that had imposed this sorts of what had come to be seen as deeply unacceptable burdens on them. So the historical mutatis mutandis, this is quite relevant now. Not because we're living in a gold standard era, no, of course not, and we have welfare states and we have banks of last resort and so on. But some of the insights about the political challenges can nevertheless be useful. As well as I mentioned, the wider comparative perspective drawn from developing countries these days, or in the last half century, I suppose. And then what we are also very interested in, of course, in this paper is what the implications are for economic governance of the Eurozone itself. We've had some really interesting contributions coming up in the last few years. I know Aidan Regan himself has been working on the problems of the mode of adjustment, we can call it that, driven by the European policymakers, that has highly differentiated consequences and implications for the European core and periphery. But what the way forward might be in terms of creating new economic institutions and the prospects for sustainability of and acceptability of different kinds of political union or creating new political capacity, they're very contested at the moment. We can see all around Europe, we can see this kind of Eurosceptic mobilisation taking place, along sort of extreme nationalist and protectionist lines across Eastern Europe, and even in France and in Italy, in Germany even. But we can see also the capacity, or the actual recent experience of the fragmentation of the political system and the extreme dissatisfaction with ongoing austerity in the countries that have been at the receiving end of loan agreements. Now, Ireland kind of with one spring we were free. Ireland may, in some respects, seem a bit of a stretch to include it in these sorts of reflections. But I persist in saying that the kind of challenges Ireland faces are not that different in some respects to those that we see particularly in Spain and in Portugal, because the growth model that has saved Ireland from terrible balance of payments, catastrophes and so on, is one that is, as we know, prone to its own problems. If you hook yourself to an external investor in the form of your American high-tech investment sector, then there are also the ways in which your growth model is biased and the ways in which the economic opportunities in the country are segmented depending on the skill and the employment sector that you're looking at. And so some of the underlying problems of development in the Irish economy and the problems of how distributed consequences are managed and so on are actually, I think, quite usefully illuminated by these sorts of reflections as well. They're being added into this sort of frame of reflection as well, comparative reflection. So the kind of the emergence or re-emergence of the EU of the periphery in the EU, I think is sorry, just I don't know, my text is beginning and ending. Has been kind of alluded to by a lot of people over the last few years. Martin Wolf, in his book, says, emerging markets learned the truth about financial markets from the painful experiences in the 1980s and 1990s. And he actually makes the connection with the Eurozone periphery itself. So in the Eurozone periphery, just as in other developing countries, the financial flows reversed to the first sign of trouble, as one would expect, of capital flows to emerging markets. So he's saying this is not sort of accidental, there's a pattern there, and it's in some sense systemic. It's something about periphery. What are we talking about there? So to look at this a little more carefully. So Dyson, in his great big book on debt, Kenneth Dyson says there's a deep-seated reluctance to see systems evolved from emerging market economies applied to advanced economies. We can recognise this, like us, developing economy, we're rich and so on. And yet, some of these parallels and commonalities, I think, can be very, very instructive. So there's when we're talking about periphery, the first thing to note, or at least in this perspective, what we're, as I said, we're zoning in on financial flows and monetary politics. But these are part of a broader syndrome of unbalanced trade relationships, current account imbalances, and the consequences for net external liabilities. The problems that developing countries have, as it were, paying their way in the world and then generating enough capital to support investment so they can upscale or increase their purchasing capacity in the world economy, those sort of things. The capital shortages inside these economies are associated with fragility in the monetary system and the financial systems, and make it difficult then for fiscal policy to be used stably and successfully. So the problems of as it were, underdevelopment or of being stuck in a disadvantageous trade situation in the world are considerable. It's hard to break out of these. The other side of periphery or peripherality, as well as the sort of broad spectrum of economic underdevelopment features, is a political dimension. Very often, periphery countries find that the institutions that are needed to support a strong, sustained development path, a growth path, are not well developed in their countries. They need them in order to be able to grow their economies more effectively. The inability to grow their economies means that these capacities are actually very hard to generate inside these countries, and so this vicious cycle of political suboptimal performance can be quite pervasive and quite hard to break. So these countries enter world markets or face world markets and face the volatility of capital flows in increasingly liberalised world markets with the capacity to adjust domestically that is quite weak. The governance capacity and the institutional buffers that would make it possible to correct big surges, inward surges or outward surges, are often quite limited. And got some couple of quotes in the paper from Geithner saying, we're going to just throw everything we've got at the financial crisis in the US, or Alistair Darling saying, we're just going to row in big time and save Northern Bank. We use all our resources. This implies not just kind of very deep pockets, of course, and the capacity to mobilise a lender last resort at very short notice in massive political negotiations, but also a capacity for coordination of administrative and financial resources to intervene effectively, decisively, and successfully. But the other side of it is of the weak governance institutional buffer is the limited state capacity. In the good times, I'm probably coming on to that in a moment, but just to prefigure it, in the good times, when resources are plentiful and the financial flows are coming in readily, the capacity to absorb new investment effectively is very difficult. This is why these countries are kind of less developed in the first place. They don't have very strong or effective ability to manage resources available for investment. And this, I think, it's a very recognisable problem in the Irish situation. There's a very poor coordination of poor capacity to think even in terms of decisive state intervention and channeling investment or facilitating credit for productive purposes. So that when you have a superfluity of capital available to you, it flows into, most readily, not into those long-term, hard, skill upgrading, productive, long-term wealth-generating areas of investment, but into the kind of the areas of quick return, or the areas of consumption spending, but particularly construction. It's just where you have scarce supply, where you have the capacity to create a bubble economy quickly, where there's competition for these assets to hold their value. That's horribly familiar.
Yeah, when you talk about state capacity, to put things in crude terms, does this mean you're talking about a civil service that's too small or not functional?
Well, there are different aspects to state capacity depending on what actual problem you're trying to analyse. That could be part of it, a skill deficit or a size deficit in your public administration. But it could mean, as I said, for example, in the case of the intervention with the experience of banking crisis, what sort of reserves do you have to mobilise? Can you call upon a central bank? Do you have the coordinated capacity to identify what the problem is, bring the various actors together in a room, look at different options, see about what the distributed information in the first instance, what the distributed consequences might be of different solutions? What happened in that night of the bank guarantee in Ireland? Chaos, lack of information, poor coordination, and very poor linkages between the financial sector and policymakers. But you might also want to be thinking about, as well as your administrative capacity, about fiscal capacity. You might want to be thinking about the sustainability or durability of your tax revenue system, and that's been very weakly developed in the Irish case. For example, we know Greece is just on the floor, and in that regard. So the capacity to generate a sustained flow of revenues that is not going to choke off your economic activity, that is widely accepted as legitimate, where you don't have to actually, where you actually have a lot of voluntary and so on. But fiscal capacity makes it possible for the state to do many other things, including build up its, industrial development or enterprise development policies. You need to have, money, not just for redistribution, but for investment in those resources and assets that support productive capacity itself. And you need that coordinating capacity to make it all in something's work very together. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Tim Besley and his collaborator, Tim Besley, is very big on fiscal capacity side of it. But it's a concept. It's one of those multidimensional concepts. State capacity. But we know what we mean, and we can unpack it for the solution of different problems as we encounter them. Okay, so sorry, that was all meant to be about meeting governance institution bias. The lack of reputation prestige is a lot of the story about managing credible commitments in world markets and keeping your currency regime going is a social and historical construction. It's a socially constructed phenomenon. It's a reputational thing, and my colleague Sam Brazes and I wrote a paper on exactly this, the way in which Ireland became pigs because of reputational contamination. And Ireland has sprung back out of the category of pigs again and again. These things are not purely dependent on the economic fundamentals, but can be contingent on reputational issues, your own reputation over time, geographical contamination of your reputation by having the bad luck of being next door to another basket case or whatever. And the third thing, the problem of peripherality is that if you want to engage in liberalisation of world markets, if you want to make big new bargains on how you peg your currency and how you actually establish yourself in the international financial market, the number of groups in your society that are just kind of going to benefit from that or that see some real advantage from it may be quite small. So there'll be huge, and if you're going to ask them to take big consequences in terms of distributed responsibility, you're not going to have so much money to spend on social welfare transfers. You're going to ask them to take a hit in terms of adjusting to the world markets by having more employment. Well, there's going to be a lot of resistance to that. So building the coalitions internally requires quite a big political effort. Yeah.
In terms of the social and historical context, do you find that there are a lot of similarities across these countries in terms of that context, or is it that there's lots of different potential ways that they've all gotten to this emerging market?
Well, yeah, what I'm suggesting here is that there are some broad themes that have been taken up as providing commonalities, and then the kind of the variance within them will depend on the particularities or peculiarities of individual countries and political economies and the path, but is path dependent on some things as well, resources that they have are path dependent. Ireland, for example, has had an inheritance of much stronger and less incorrupt public administration from early on, relatively speaking. This is something short-like verily there. But we know that, and I'll come on to that in a moment, because the governance system is corrupted, it does get corrupted by not the civil service itself, but the broader governance regime gets corrupted by, the problem. It's just very hard to resist the corrupting effects of cheap money and those things. So these are kind of cluster concepts. They go together, financial maturity and creditworthiness go together. So I want to move rapidly on and talk about some of these things, the features, kind of commonalities that come out of the development literature. And one of them is the idea of original sin, meaning the capacity of countries to borrow abroad in their own currency, just to actually sustain their own debt, to borrow, to get people to invest in government bonds, basically in your own currency. It's a credibility issue. How are you going to persuade world markets that you are a good bet? And the terms in which you do that are prohibitive for developing countries, and so they end up borrowing in world markets in foreign currencies. And this was a major problem for Ireland back in the 1980s, where huge amounts of the public debt were in foreign currencies, and currency fluctuations then had very severe effects on the government's capacity to manage the exchequer borrowing requirement, which is what we were all obsessing about at the time. So that weakness in capacity to borrow credibly At the same time, the fear of floating, if you had a strong currency peg, it'd be quite attractive, right? But the fear of floating is pervasive and endemic because you just don't know what's going to happen. And we see this with Greece. When the Germans decided that the risks of kicking them out of the euro wouldn't be quite as great, last year, wouldn't be quite as great as they had feared back in 2010. They were on the brink of dropping over the precipice. But Syriza just did a sudden break halt at the edge of the cliff, in spite of whatever Varoufakis may have wanted to take. Syriza said, actually, no. You jump over the cliff and you might not fly, you might go into free fall and have a horrible smash at the end of the cliff, and then it'll take you a very long time to recover. And so floating, breaking away from a fixed currency regime, was also immensely risky because the credibility of your currency is going to be problematic. That's why you decided to peg in the first place. So these reputational issues on international markets again are very damaging to developing countries because they look like they're in trouble at levels of debt that are much lower than those that mature economies are able to sustain. And not just because countries like Italy or Belgium have big chunks of their debt denominated or at least held in domestic hands, but confidence ebbs when some countries, this is variable, there is no magic number of 80% debt to GDP ratio. Developing countries can default at 60% to 30% GDP debt ratio, depending on, because it's a confidence thing, it is a social constructive thing, and these things have a history, they're institutionally embedded and they're path dependent. Sudden stops is the absolute catastrophe that happens when the flexibility in financial markets, when financial flows stop. And they can stop for any number of reasons, and it's often a political shock. They're perfectly happy, the lenders from which countries are perfectly happy to let the money flow and to turn the taps on. They think they're getting a great return. The growth rates are not good enough in the poor economies. The periphery looks like a better bet because it's behind, it's lagging, and so a bit of extra money will generate high returns as the money flows outwards. But something happens to shake confidence, and then the sudden stop means that all the taps are switched off all at once, and I have horrible experience here. The banks that borrowed short and then long and so on, and you find yourself in that juddering chaos where the bicycle stops and you fall off, and the shock can be almost random. Financial immaturity, meaning that it's very hard to actually graduate then from, if you find yourself in a debtor's kind of prison or reputational under a reputational label in world markets, it's very hard to actually overcome that and to be able to float plausibly again. And the great risk for Ireland, of course, coming out of the loan agreement was, would it be able to actually sell government bonds again credibly in the world market? And the huge achievement was that they were actually able to get back into world markets and to borrow at rates that were acceptable. And that sort of graduation from financial maturity is kind of unusual in comparative terms, and I wouldn't like to be trying to lend from Greece at the moment these days, for example. So, sorry, that financial immaturity means that graduation from crisis then is very difficult to achieve. So, coming on now to the politics. So, as I said, this dilemma of floating or pegging is an enduring one, it's a recurring one for the periphery. You float your economy and you're at risk of the value being very volatile. You peg and you're committing yourself to a lot of hardship in order to maintain the peg. But the peg, or the vincolo esterno, as the Italians call it, has kind of become, it's almost become an English word now. Pegging yourself to an external anchor can be seen as a shortcut to credibility in world markets. If your currency is pegged to this, then you can borrow on, you hope, fairly similar terms to the strong country whose currency you're emulating or that you're linked to. And that's very attractive for periphery countries. It means that, sorry, I'll just tell you, this is, again, an example from the gold standard was a core that followed the high road of more or less complete gold convertibility, an infamous periphery that had trouble pegging, that resented floating, or fear of floating. And had trouble pegging, doing this thing credibly. And the dilemmas faced us in the context of European integration again. But the point about pegging yourself to a vincolo estero means that you gain credibility, you can do this borrowing in international markets, and the assumption then is, or at least the requirement, the expectation would be, that you actually build the support coalitions domestically that make this thing sustainable, steady. In other words, that you use this external commitment device to reform the expectations and the preference structures of key constituencies in your society, the better to be able to actually run this commitment long term without major political crises. And for example, Ireland looked like it was doing this quite stably or successfully during the 1990s. Ireland said, yay, we've broken with sterling because we thought that was bad for us, we were importing too much inflation. But hey, EMS turned out to be really quite volatile, it's kind of tricky to do this. This EMU thing is coming up, and admittedly, again, politically, we want to be one of the big boys in there with the monetary and improve trade and break our trade dependence on Britain, and many other political reasons, quite apart from the economic security of pegging more stably to the Deutsche. But during the 1990s, when the compliance requirements of Maastricht were still had this element of conditionality about them, when the yay, nay, gateway in 1999 was still to come down, this induced a great deal of transformation of behaviour and of expectations in Irish political institutions and political practices. And people will tell you that it did change the parameters of social partnership, for example. It actually became internalised into the preference structure of labour market institutions. And so it was looking like quite a good political bet, as if Ireland had successfully negotiated a new politics of monetary commitment. And that's a hard thing to do, but it's very hard to do continuously, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the politics further mean that anchoring then is it's a commitment device. Anchoring your currency is handy for governing elites because it buys this credibility immediately. But then the pre-commitment, the problem of pre-commitment is that it induces a certain kind of instability into your domestic politics. Kind of credibility that you buy can induce a certain impetus to be a little bit lax about what you actually do thereafter. Like Ulysses binds himself to the post to listen to the sirens, but he can listen to the sirens, he can engage in this risky behaviour, this dangerous behaviour because of his binding. Or if you pre-commit your currency and you gain credibility, then you can actually be a little bit too lax about bedding down those institutional behaviours that need to change. So the external solution to cooperation is useful. It's very I'm running out of time. It's very useful. It's useful to have this binding thing, but then generating the capacity for internal commitment is much more difficult and more challenging. Institutional complementarities is a term that comes from varieties of capitalism literature. And I don't mean to use it in the same technical sense that they use in which they've used it, but the capacity to adjust your political economy functioning so as to meet the requirements of your currency commitment could actually be achieved quite successfully as long as you have these externally binding devices with conditionality attached. When the conditionality is gone, or when the incentives change, this is when you can actually find that the institutional arrangements you've tried to set up to support your foreign peg start to collapse. And this happens particularly, it happens in good times as well as bad. I can't remember where I was going to say this. Okay, I'll just say more about that in a moment. An institutional cascade, meaning that the institutional capacity to actually deal with these things crumbles under the new kinds of pressures that you encounter when the moment of testing comes. and the testing will happen in the bad times. So if these capacities are not built up in the good times, they won't survive the bad times. So these monetary anchors are also political anchors. If you have a monetary anchor, it is only doing part of the work. It's only as good as the political assurance that these commitments will and can be sustained. And this is a deeply political process. External commitments will only take you so far. An ongoing political process of adjustment and active management of every process is constantly required. So, the political economy of the vincolo esterno, in the sense of the EMU, offers loads of obvious parallels here in the terms in which countries adjusted to participation in EMU itself. Which brings us immediately on to the question of state capacity. Because the contention here is that it's these features of emerging marketisation, precisely these ones about financial vulnerability, that shaped, first of all, the kinds of conditions that led our four countries to be in the worst situation when the crisis arrived, to experience the crisis most severely, and then to actually deal with the Great Recession and to manage a way out of it. And by this, I mean precisely the paradox of plenty. Sorry, I was just making these slides late last night. I can't remember where I meant to say this, but perhaps I better say it here. The pathways to crisis were paved by the excess of ready money. The fact that our countries suddenly found that their interest rates, as we know, were on the floor. We were effectively, the markets were saying, we never noticed, Ireland is not in fact Ireland, Greece is not in fact Greece, they're all Germany. And so lending at these low rates, that their own performance and own economic structures would not have merited, and their history of debt management and so on would not have merited. And so this influx of cheap money led to all the consequences I mentioned before, the flow into unproductive resources, and the further implications for the distortion of the incentives for economic development, the derailing of the sustainable growth model, essentially. So the pathways to crisis were generated themselves by the conditions under which these countries actually entered EMU. So the vulnerability to these surges of capital inflow and the incentives created to borrow massively at interest rates that were actually in negative terms are very characteristic of developing markets. All the incentives were there to take the brakes off and do crazy stuff. And you do crazy stuff in a casino and you get great returns in the short term. And then suddenly, at some point, the lights go on and the money bags, take up the money and go home. And the flight to quality happens immediately. And your casino is drained and suddenly you actually have maybe a few highways and motorways and so on, but no basic fundamental improvement in the productive capacity of your economy. And so this means that the range of policy options during the Great Recession after a sudden stop experience like that are constrained, and all the more constrained because of multi-level EU governance and the restrictions on fiscal policy and on enterprise policy and so on. But the range of policy options is very much narrowed by having to continue to live within a fixed currency regime in a situation where the taps have been turned off, So none of this was noticed, as we now know, and what was not noticed, of course, has been getting more attention recently, and a lot of attention has been given to balance of payments, disparities, or the accumulation of balance of payments, disproportionalities or imbalances between periphery and core. But behind that, I think there are this political economy phenomenon of financial vulnerability that has not been much explored. It's probably slightly outside the margins of most economists' interests, and probably beyond the range of attention of a lot of EU experts. But I think this perspective is very very helpful. And what we've had, of course, in the Eurozone is an attempt to manage the domestic experiences within EMU through the enforcement of rules. So deliberately we've seen, very weak institutional coordination capacity, very, very weak institutional construction. At the EU level, everything was, at the Eurozone level itself, everything was supposed to be managed through domestic, financial oversight on the one hand and fiscal disciplines on the other. So rules-based compliance and rules-based and external rules-based performance without conditionality turned out to be a very flexible and ad hoc arrangement, tested not by the periphery but by the core itself, which was Germany and France in 2003, 2004, who exposed the dangers of having this very ad hoc approach to adjustments. And the failure to bed in the incentives was became quite impossible. The political demands of bedding in were quite impossible, I think, in the periphery. But similarly, in the context of recovery or of post-crisis or during and after the crisis, a rules-based, a stronger, tighter rules-based approach to managing adjustment has been essentially the one thing that the European Commission can do, and so this is what it does do, and so we get fiscal compact and so on. With all the consequences we know about, macroeconomists would say this is bonkers from a macro European economy point of view to be intensifying the spiralling down the recessionary effect of these kind of pro-cyclical tightening. So rules-based performance outcomes put these countries in a particular bind. So in the bad times, when the sudden stop happens, the adjustment capacity is very poor, it's very weak. What to do, chaos. So I have noted, I'm trying to note that our countries survived chaos through the EU, and there's not a big EU grant, right? So the capacity to find a loan agreement, save them from certain sorts of hazards. Iceland found its own route to recovery through its own political economy resources, not necessarily to say that it would have been a good or viable one for Ireland, may or may not. We didn't choose to try it. We chose to take the shelter of EU loans at the risk of entering into this tighter conditionality and rules-based mode of adjustment. So, sorry, this is where I actually meant to talk about. The limited absorption capacity of financial flows in the good times and the flow to unproductive investment and the pollution of institutional resources. I mean precisely the kind of the poor incentives that are set up for money to be made through distorting political decision making and through this kind of these toxic coalitions of bankers, builders, property developers. With these very opaque relationships about how decisions are made and consequences that are decidedly suboptimal for how the resources are used in the good times. And it's this lack of capacity in the good times that I think the really damaging side of this peripherality. That these countries, other countries have housing crises and excessive housing speculation and bubbles and so on. Denmark had, Britain had. But when the crash came, they had these deeper institutional resources, they had much richer, more diversified economies. So they didn't find that suddenly, 50% of their youth were out of work, as has happened in Spain, because all the incentives to abandon education as a route to economic advancement and go into construction. And there's a whole generation lost to this overemphasis on construction, and if anything, the distorting effects of construction in the Irish economy were possibly worse. So thirdly then, the democratic issue of the issue of legitimation in hard currency regimes. So as I said, what we need is, what these countries badly need is well-developed, mature state capacity to back credible commitment and then to build domestic coalitions of support for this hard currency peg. And the ability to do that can be quite testing. Because it means in the good times you have to dampen expectations about what governments could be doing with these surges of money that come in and this ability to borrow cheaply. And these were exactly pressures that we saw in Ireland, to let the public purse strings loose and to be able to make all sorts of extra spending commitments on the basis of these short-term capital surges. And in the bad times then, when things go wrong, you're actually asking your population to take the hit in the form of this increased unemployment. You can't devalue your currency. And so the sudden stop means a cessation of economic activity with very severe distributive consequences, very unevenly distributed, as we know. So, I mean, in a situation where you have mature welfare states, people are not going to actually starve, but the hardships involved in losing incomes and the implications then for the destruction of wealth are immense. And it's the destruction of wealth in the bad times as well as the mismanagement of the good times. There's this real sort of besetting problem of peripheries in general. You need to take this like 2 steps forward and 1 3/4 steps back in a crisis, or 5 steps back, and it takes you 10 years to get back to where you were. Which puts enormous strains on the compensation mechanisms. Some things you just can't compensate for. We know that in the Irish case, for example, Ireland was put under enormous duress to bail out the banks to make good all the loans and debts and for bondholders in the banks. But what about the private equity losses associated with the loss of value in houses and all those people in negative equity? That's a distributed cost as well. That's a strain and compensation mechanisms as to where, because it's not just about cutting welfare payments and transfer payments, it's about who is going to be left exposed and who is going to be offered security. So this is a quote from Paul de Grauwe. He said, from an economic point of view, flexibility is the solution at the EU level. This is their assumption that structural adjustment will create conditions for new growth. But from a social and political point of view, flexibility is the problem. Now, first of all, I defer to the economists in our midst, but as far as I know, economists are now saying that from the economic point of view, flexibility is actually not the solution, and that there is no empirical evidence that if you flexibilise everything in question as a matter of ideological commitment, you will automatically produce growth. If you do it in a targeted way, if there are particular bottlenecks or constraints, and you can improve the quality of economic performance, the intervention can be effective, but as a matter of just how you get out of the crisis, this seems to be really actually empirically poorly grounded. But the political and social consequences of an insistence on deregulation, on trying to dismantle, for example, the labour market. Well, I'm not saying that the Spanish labour market is perfect, right? It's not. There are 2-tier employment structures right now, but trying to fix this in the middle of a crisis at the cost of more hardships is going to be a big political ask, huge political ask, before you even talk about hardship upon hardship in Greece, with the temptation to just dig in and resist changes, even if they might be seen as reforms, must be immense. So the implications then, just really didn't mean to speak for so long, so sorry. Future developments then. Where is Europe going to go with all this? Clearly there is a need for better and more transnational governance capacity or governance capabilities, and we have seen them being created in sort of piecemeal format. We've seen the stability mechanism being created as a long-term pot, and there are ideas about debt mutualisation and some elements of social compensation that wouldn't involve huge great leaps to having a Europe-wide fiscal transfers, and so they'd be very administratively difficult and politically very contentious. So there are some evidence. There's some evidence of transnational a need for more, but also the slow move towards more governance capabilities. But it's extraordinarily slow, and it's fraught with political contestation, and it's highly intergovernmental. And one of the things that our periphery perspective also reveals is the importance of power, just the degree to which power, national imbalances and power relationships can be a determining factor in shaping how countries get to engage in the international political economy. And the dominance of the German economy and the leading role of ideas that are very plausible for Germany, but quite inappropriate in the political context of situations of other periphery countries, is one of the problems in devising appropriate and sustainable ways forward for the EU at large, and specifically the Eurozone. And the legitimation needs, what our perspective suggests is that it's not just a question of more Europe or less Europe, of devolving or getting back to a protectionist regime, whatever that might look like, or of leaping up to political union in some undifferentiated way. But our perspective, our periphery perspective, suggests that there are more subtle things involved. That it's not just a question of democratic deficit. That if you look at the pathways from the periphery, if you look at the whole experience of how our different countries have emerged, that the question of the institutional differentiation in different countries looms much, much larger than you would imagine. And so it's not just a question of rules-based compliance. An attempt to achieve stability through tightening the rules can actually end up being very destabilising, or end up in just these very ad hoc modes of adjustment. And there's an enormous amount of work done in labour markets and writers, capitalism literature on institutional flexibility. The institute, it's like the leopard, it's like crazy when the young Risorgimento guy says to his the old count, the father, when they see the aristocracy being swept away in mid-19th century Sicily, and Count Crazy says, I'm going with this Risorgimento. And he says, why? Because everything must change if we want everything to stay the same. So if you insist on maintaining everything the same through rules, there will be at risk of crumbling, of cracking under the strain. But if there's resilience possible in the institutional adaptation or the mode of requiring concordance rather than rule following, that could actually be much more sustainable. I don't have the solution to that, or working in the EU right now, but it's certainly one of the lessons that comes out of our account. So just finally, this is where I think we've got to. The periphery offers currency pegging, gives enormous possibilities and opportunities as well as dangers and vulnerability. The European political economy, the international political economy, does actually integrate countries in different and asymmetrical ways. So what we think we can offer is not a new theory of periphery, but a periphery twist, as it were, on the story of European integration and of the Eurozone crisis. So I'm so sorry for having talked so long, but if you can stay for a few more minutes, I'd be delighted to.